So I've been anticipating this conversation probably, well, even before we asked you to come on to the show. And I'm so glad that you came on. Thank you for coming on. How are you?
I'm good. Thank you for having me. I'm excited to have the conversation too.
Oh gosh, Lisa, we have so much to dive into because of the fact that I think this is something that so many people relate to, but yet are not really necessarily clear what it is and what are these, basically what can happen when you are suffering from this. Yeah. But we're going to dive deep into imposter syndrome. So could you tell us basically what is the definition of imposter syndrome?
So it's this experience when you are credentialed, skilled, experienced, have, necessary abilities to do what you're doing, and yet you haven't internalized that. And as a result of not internalizing that, you're constantly fearing that you might be exposed as a fraud. And as a result of that fear of being exposed as a fraud, you either overfunction, overwork, and overdo things, or you self-sabotage and engage in sabotage behaviors that kind of get you caught in this like perpetual cycle.
So here's my question, because I've heard this, again, this expression tossed around quite a bit. And a lot of times there's a lot of people that don't have credentials or, even degrees, but yet they've had the experience to do the job. Yep. Do you feel like that is also the same, or is that more prevalent with that demographic?
Yeah, I mean, I think it doesn't necessarily matter if you have like degrees, but having skills, experience, competencies to be able to do the job, but yet not knowing that. Because I see people who have PhDs. I've lived that where I have a PhD and I feel like a fraud, even with the credentials. So the credentials are not really what makes you ever feel like you've actually been able to master it. It's really just not being able to internalize it and not knowing what to do with your successes, the things that you have been good at, and how to actually take them in and own them and make them yours.
So how many people do you think like at large? Because if I was to like hazard a guess, like every single person on the planet at some point or another has felt this. Because I've had a debate with my girlfriend this morning where we were talking about it. She's like, are you kidding? Everybody at some point or another in their lives have had this. What is your opinion, or is there any studies about it?
Yeah, there are. So the general kind of data that has been seen over the research of 40 years has been about 70% of people experience it. There are people who never experience it, who don't. It's different than self-doubt. It's not necessarily this experience that people talk about it, self-doubt. It's anxiety. It's more than that. And so
what's the difference between self-doubt and this? I mean, it seems kind of the same.
Yeah, except for with self-doubt, you're not necessarily going to be fearing that you're going to be exposed as a fraud, or you don't engage in some of the hallmarks of imposter syndrome, which are things like intellectual inauthenticity, where you sort of downplay what you know in audiences that may feel like insecure because you know more than they do. So you kind of play a particular role and make yourself small. Also engaging in behaviors like having mentors solely for the purpose of external validation, not necessarily utilizing mentors for all that they can support you in. So there are all these additional behaviors, high perfectionism, overestimating others and underestimating yourself. So all these different actual kind of behaviors that belong in the constellation of imposter syndrome that are bigger than self-doubt and anxiety about how you're doing. It's greater than that. So when people actually start to realize that they have it, they're like, oh yes, I have that. If it's just self-doubt, it's not an experience of imposter syndrome. That's just normal self-doubt.
So self-doubt would not necessarily manifest into all these other things that are coming out. Because I always figured, imposters, whether it be imposter syndrome or self-doubt, though I kind of thought of them as one and the same. Normally, I always figured that was just internalized and it wasn't really creating any behaviors. So finding a mentor and not necessarily utilizing them to grow, but more so utilizing them for validation. Is that like validation, I would assume, is a big one?
Yeah. I mean, I think that's external validation is a big one. Is sort of looking for others to kind of validate what you're doing, that you're good enough, and never being able to validate yourself and really having trouble doing that. That it can be a component of it, a particular significant one. That's why people who kind of say self-doubt are not capturing the entire experience of what imposter syndrome feels like and why everyone doesn't experience it. Some people actually experience the opposite of it, which is Dunning-Kruger syndrome, where it's that you believe you're an expert when you are not. And so there are all kinds of different ways people show up, and it's not always.
I might know some people like that.
Right.
Wow. So, okay. So one of the ways that it plays its way out is through mentors. And I just want to kind of rewind and go over, like kind of grab at them, because and it's funny because I don't really think about it, because I am absolutely sure that I've had times in my life that I felt this. And I always wondered, do people know? Can they see it?
Yeah. Yeah.
So let's dive into some of the things that people go through and what they see, what the world sees. So, I mean, aside from that, I'm sorry, we're going to rewind. What was some of the other things that people do that people can see?
Sure. So things like, engaging in sort of overestimating others. So you look at somebody else and you're like, wow, look what they're doing and look how poorly I'm doing. So getting in these social comparisons where everyone's always doing better, you're always doing worse. Things like, oh, go ahead.
No, but in the meantime, I'm assuming that you're still performing, you know.
And that's another piece of this too, is that people who have imposter syndrome are usually very high performers. So they're succeeding, they're doing well generally, unless the self-sabotage component is a really significant part of their imposter syndrome. And then sometimes they are not succeeding. But there's often this experience of being successful at the things you do, just never taking it in, typically attributing it to things like luck, a mistake, a relationship, accidents. So not necessarily taking it in as I did that, I have the skill to do that, instead being like all these other factors contributed to it, doesn't belong to me.
Admittedly, that's a very interesting. It kind of actually made me go down a little path. I sit there and I think of the amount of times that I have, say luck, just pure dumb luck, that I came across this company that I work for and I'm really excited about. But also I often say, and I wonder if this plays into it. I often say the universe had a big hand in it, and, or in some places people would say God or whatever your religious belief.
If you were John
Do you
Milton,
think that's instead of like owning what you have done to lead you to that path? I mean, I'm not trying to negate, any kind of God or, whatever higher power that you believe in doesn't have a hand in watching over. But really, we always say, they help those who help themselves,
Right. or like John Milton said, luck is the residue of good planning. So, so it's
that
really,
expression.
Yeah. And it's really sort of an important thing. I think when we take out the locus of control away from us, it becomes harder then to attribute it to ourselves. It becomes somebody else, something else, then it becomes impossible to replicate. And so, then we're sort of really trying to replicate it through our overfunctioning, overwork, overproduction, which only leads to chronic burnout and doesn't necessarily lead to the outcomes we're often seeking.
But isn't it like chicken or the egg? I mean, we're working really hard and we're doing all these extra hours and we're overachieving in that regard. So everybody's completely, content with what you're doing. But if you were to pull back and not work as hard, I think the fear would be like, all of a sudden you're underperforming. Yeah. You're not doing what everybody has seen from you. And then isn't that kind of like a self-fulfilling prophecy when it comes to being an imposter? No, you're not doing what everybody said thought.
I mean, I think when you're kind of working on your imposter syndrome, trying to really get rid of it because you see the significant consequences for you, you start to recognize that the overworking and overfunctioning isn't necessary to succeed. Because oftentimes we think that the imposter syndrome has gotten us where we are at. It's not true. Our skills, abilities, experiences, all of that stuff has gotten us where we've gotten. It's not the imposter syndrome. It's not the overfunctioning. It's not the overwork. It's not the feeling like I'm never good enough. Those are unhealthy kinds of ways to kind of approach who you are and what you do. So people who tell you imposter syndrome is good for you, there are no research studies to suggest that. There's no positive correlates to imposter syndrome. There are only things that are detrimental for you, and you will be successful without it. And oftentimes people can't recognize that.
So when it comes to the kind of intrusive thoughts that people can have about imposter syndrome, like when I talked about it with my friends or family or whoever, that I said, oh, we're going to have this topic, they're all like, oh, I love to hear that one. But I'm going to assume that they kind of already knew, oh, I felt that, or, oh, I've had that experience. Yeah. But for those that are kind of running on the treadmill, but they're not really sure what is it, self-doubt, or is this imposter syndrome? What is it that they should look at internally, that would differentiate the two?
Yeah. I mean, I think it is sort of all these different pieces that we're talking about. So it's like a constellation of things. So it's the things like, you find yourself overworking, looking for validation, like not being able to internalize the wins, really struggling to kind of say no or set boundaries because you don't want to displease people, finding yourself shrinking to make other people happy with you, avoiding conflict because you think that might, not necessarily please others. So it's a bunch of different behaviors that you're engaging in to try to cover up this idea that you don't belong, that you are fraudulent, that you're not good enough. And sort of that constant chasing of that experience. I mean, I think, do we all feel self-doubt at times? Yes. But the experience of imposter syndrome for people is very pervasive. It's not like they experience it once, but they've experienced it many, many, many different times in different contexts and different places. And I think that's when it is something different than just a little self-doubt here and there.
So it's more of a chronic thing. So it would have to be treated per se.
Well, it's not a mental health disorder. It's not a diagnosis. It doesn't require necessarily treatment. But I think what I think is important is dealing with it and addressing sort of some of the issues that underlie it. And then also to really kind of get some of the impact away from. So the things like anxiety is correlated with imposter syndrome, depression is correlated with imposter syndrome, lack of knowledge of the job market is correlated with imposter syndrome, greater loyalty to your organization is sort of, so all these things that are not necessarily great for you are correlated. So you definitely want to consider kind of working to kind of overcome it, because it's not necessarily your best friend, even though we often feel like it is what's made us who we are.
So what are the big steps that I think people can do, even just on their own, to start working on that?
Yeah. So one of the things we talk about very fundamentally in the very beginning of dealing with it is figuring out where it came from. So it came from somewhere. And I think what's useful about understanding where it came from is you begin to then understand, why is it looking the way it does today? And that can help you interrupt the cycle. So for example, one of the reasons why people develop imposter syndrome is because they were put in rigid roles as a child. So for example, they were either seen as the intelligent one, the one who is really good at getting things, they get things quickly. And then anytime they ever had to work hard at something, they felt like it was revelation that they weren't as good as everyone thought they were, or the hardworking one. So you were one in the family where it wasn't necessarily, things didn't come easy to you. So things required work. And then you never got to see what your natural talents or natural gifts were. Everything was just about hard work, grit, over functioning. And then we talk about a third one too, in the survivor category, where there wasn't a parent or a caregiver telling you were one or the other. There was a lack of support. And so as a result, your achievements became a way to get out. And so one of the reasons why that's really useful for us is because we come to understand why we've developed this. And also too, why we are looking for the external validation, or why we're over functioning or overworking, or why we're engaging in particular rigid roles in imposter syndrome that are such a function of it, that it's really very helpful to kind of understand the triggers in the current day world, So something
so
like
when
that.
You're able to identify, all right, whatever it may be, that might have been the root cause. I mean, maybe this is a bigger conversation than this podcast, but I mean, what steps do you have to get? Because I will sit there and I'm like, okay, now I can identify X, Y, and Z. Okay, there it is. Now what?
Yeah. So now it's about sort of like figuring out sort of why that leads to the current trigger. So for example, sometimes people have triggers around a particular type of manager. So for example, a withholding manager, someone who doesn't necessarily give you positive feedback, but you have to kill it in order for them to kind of actually give you any kind of feedback. So you start to recognize why you're doing that, and you can dislocate it. And so we have these exercises in our book around really being able to identify how this all got started and working on letting that early stuff go, because letting go of that avoids this idea of what we call the repetition compulsion. So this need to keep repeating these behaviors to try to fix them, because that repeating is not going to fix it. What is going to fix it is interrupting the connection between those early experiences and the today experiences. And so what we're trying to do is disconnect the trigger from an automatic behavior you've been learning since you were a kid. But it takes a consciousness about why it is and what you're trying to work on.
So the book that you were speaking of, what book is that?
So my book, sort of with my partner, so Own Your Greatness, Overcome Imposter Syndrome, Beat Self-Doubt, and Succeed in Life. So it's a workbook. It's a skill-building workbook based on the interventions that have been shown in the research to really move the needle on imposter syndrome.
So beyond that, I mean, if you start working on it, you're starting to have some kind of success in all this. I think the hard part is people really identifying whether, like, I hear what you're saying, that you can identify where the root causes, there are certain behavior patterns or certain thought patterns. But I guess there is a part of us that sit there and think, what is the reality? I mean, if you are going into a scenario, and this is something that someone actually just brought up, and they thought this was what imposter syndrome was, is that you are getting a promotion, let's just say, and you have been working really hard, you're doing really well, and you have the degrees or whatever it is behind you, but you're being moved into something that has a lot of things that are out of your experience or out of your circle of knowledge. And so you got to scramble to learn. I see, to me, that just is kind of like the equivalent of fake it till you make it. I mean, it's just, to me, it's one thing, but
it's exactly what I was talking about regarding the early childhood experiences, right? So if it depends on sort of what your approach was as a kid, right? So if you were the intelligent one, when things don't come easy to you in that new job, you're going to feel like, I don't belong here. I'm a fake. See, I'm not as good as I thought. Instead of being like, everything requires work. All learning requires work. Until I am dead, I will not stop learning. Like, that is just a function of being human and being alive, is that, but we have this very skewed and very kind of dichotomous perspective. Either we're great at something or we're a failure, as opposed to the idea that everything new, every kind of new opportunity requires some new skill set you're going to have to build over time. That's just a growth perspective and mindset, as opposed to, you're not faking it. You needed those early skills that you had to kind of get to where you're getting. But this perspective and this very dichotomous lens that I must be faking it if I'm not getting it perfect immediately.
But do you think that society in many ways has such a high expectation of people that they should automatically get it, that they're put into these certain roles and, okay, nail it. In the meantime, you need to kind of have the bandwidth to be able to grow and stretch into that space.
Yes, I would completely agree that our systems and our work cultures don't necessarily allow for real human growth, and really don't support learning in roles, and really don't know how, some managers and some organizations really don't know how to help people develop. They don't understand how it works.
I feel like there should be like coursework or something for every single business major.
Every manager, yes, absolutely. Like, because a lot of people get into leadership roles and they've never had one coaching experience, one class, one nothing on management. And they're then responsible for people's development, lives, futures. And they hold them in their hands, but they do it in these kinds of very unskilled ways, but have real impact on people's feelings, development, what they think. I've worked with people who had a bad interaction with a manager 20 years ago that they're still holding on to. And it's making it difficult for them to internalize anything presently, even though they're a star. But that one impact of the thing that got said to them in a performance review stayed with them, Well,
I think especially when you're younger and you're just starting your career and you happen to have like a manager or something, or a superior in work or whatever, that is more so focused on just get it done. You don't know how to do it, we'll figure it out, as opposed to really being that, leader, and mentoring a person through it and developing through it. It is rather astonishing how it can affect you throughout the rest of your career. And it's something that you have to get past.
Yeah. And I think also too, like, it can happen at any point in your career. Like, there's a lot of toxic leadership going around. And, trauma at work is a real thing, and being traumatized and feeling like the impact of it. I don't think we often give it enough credibility. We think trauma happens from a large incident, but you can be traumatized from work, and those things can really affect the future of your own career.
So we're talking a lot about work life, which seems to be one of the more common things, because often we're put into positions that we're like, I don't know how to do this. But I would think, and correct me if I'm wrong, I would imagine socially and even, in a familial way, that could happen as well. I know a lot of moms out there, and dads, I'm sure, that are sitting there going, I am unequipped. I have not been given instructions. Why is this not natural to me? Or even in the social realm, I know for myself when I was younger, and I would even actually come to think of it, even to today, I can be very sociable like this and everything like that. But really, in my heart of hearts, I would rather be hiding in the wall, because they would find out I am not this funny or interesting.
Right. Yeah. I mean, I think it can carry over into other domains. And I hear people say that a lot, but I feel like it shows up in my social life in the terms of me, kind of downplaying what I know or downplaying who I am or downplaying my accomplishments, not sharing them. I don't want to make people uncomfortable. So it can show up in the way, the authenticity that you present in social situations. I think it can also present in your parenting and feeling like you're comparing yourself to other parents and the way that you're doing with your kid. And like, I'm not doing as good and I must not know what I'm doing. So it can show up in a variety of arenas. I totally feel like that. It's definitely not solely located in the world of work.
I feel like particularly with parents in general, I think it's so hard. And because I feel, not to go again all squirrely, but I often feel like in previous generations, it did kind of take a village to raise a child. You usually had your grandparents, your aunts and uncles. You had a lot of family that really got together and helped you raise a child. But nowadays it seems as though between, families are all working, they all have very independent lives. And though, they're going to be a part of your life, they're not necessarily like a lot of people living in the same household, day to day, and assistance. I mean, do you feel as though, I do, I feel like it's more prevalent with parents.
Yeah. I don't know if there's no data to suggest that it is. And I think oftentimes people are saying, it's more prevalent in women. It's more prevalent in these. There's no data to suggest it's more prevalent in these domains. But I do think what is important to recognize is how it can be in a variety of parts of your life and you don't even recognize it. And that you don't have to live like that, even though you can see a lot of people are also living with you like that. It just doesn't have to stay that way. And I think you point to a really important piece of this too, is that oftentimes when we're struggling with imposter syndrome, we do a lot of it on our own. A lot of it, that inner voice is happening by ourselves. And community is such a central part of overcoming it, is learning to build broader, because our communities don't sit with us naturally and in kind of like the way that we live anymore. We need to build very strong community around us that can actually help us kind of move out of these kinds of ways of thinking that we need to kind of do this alone, suffer alone, kind of get through things. Is kind of in some ways, an
find our tribes, right?
Yeah. Centrally important to kind of really combating it and really being open about it and having places to be open about it.
So from there, if someone felt as though they were like had a really difficult time with this, like they are trying to do something, they're trying to do a workbook or something along that line. I know that at least with social media and everything like that, the term imposter syndrome is very, very trendy right now. Yes. But if they were to like search out a therapist or a psychologist or whoever and say, I feel as though I'm suffering from imposter syndrome, would they look at them like, come on, please?
Some might. It's trendy, but the concept is over 40 years old. It was initially kind of posited in 1978 by two female psychologists, Doctors Clance and Imes, who are working in a Georgia counseling center and seeing this in women. That's where the myth of it happens.
Interesting. So it was in women?
That's where they saw it initially, is in women, and they posited about women. So they talked about women initially in their first article in 1978. So this concept is not trendy whatsoever. It has 40 years of research behind it. So all these people saying like, it's not real. It's real. They're actually measurements, instruments, assessment, researchers who study it. The issue is because it is not diagnostic, it is not in the DSM or the ICD-11. It is not necessarily required for study necessarily. So some psychologists, social workers may have never heard of it, may not know how to do with it. And so you want to ask somebody, if you're looking for somebody, do you know the concept? Do you know how to work with it? Can you help me work with this? And some people will say, no, I don't believe in it. It's not real, even though it is real. And so you want to find somebody who actually really gets it and knows how to support people. And there are people out there who can.
I want to rewind to the fact that it was a women's study, because I'm sorry, that is fascinating. Yes. I'm wondering, I mean, God, I would love to jump into those two women's brain and find out why they suddenly thought, hey, we got to find out. Because I sit there and I think, really, I mean, what was it, 1978?
In 1978 is when they
1978. And that's really when women were just kind of started going out in the workforce.
Yeah.
Oh, I could see where that could be an issue.
And they were seeing it in grad students and faculty members and administrators at the college. And they were seeing what seemed more than self-doubt, what seemed like this almost kind of like constellation of experiences that seemed so similar across them, but yet was not talked about anywhere. And they are very big on not calling this imposter syndrome. They call it imposter phenomenon because they don't want it to be medicalized or kind of seen as pathology. So they don't like the term syndrome. They like the term phenomenon. And so, it is where they initially saw it. But in the 80s, research started to show that men experience it too. There's been actually no studies to suggest that there's been some studies that say women experience it more, but then there's studies that find it equivocal. So there's no definitive kind of research to show that it's more predominant in women at this point. But that has been the mythology that has followed it.
Out of curiosity, obviously with syndrome, it seems a little bit more clinical. Why phenomenon?
Because it is sort of an unusual occurrence, something worthy of note, as opposed to something that is considered sort of medical.
I would imagine societal. That was like a shift. Women going back into the workforce a lot stronger in that time, and that would make it a phenomenon, I would imagine.
Yeah.
That is fascinating. I really
it's fascinating. The research is really fascinating. I think that's when people don't recognize. People think of it as a social media concept. It is not. It is a social psychological concept that is over 40 years old and has been studied a number of times. And there's all kinds of interesting research on it. And that's what I think my book was really focused on, is like really introducing people to the research, because all of it is sort of based on the research, not based on, social media posts, which are just really about clickbait and really trying to get people to kind of, clicking point.
So what made you decide to dive into that specialty?
Because I experienced it myself, because I lived it. And my TEDx talk is really about my own experience of it. And it was really profound for me. Clearly it didn't change the success trajectory, which I was saying earlier. It doesn't change how successful you can be, but it changed how much I could enjoy it. And it changed how much I actually felt control over what my future could be. I really was focused on what other people wanted from me and trying to please other people, whether it was mentors or family or whatever it was. I really didn't really know what I wanted for myself. I wasn't really tapped into that. And then what had happened, and I talk about this in TEDx talk, but I had a really toxic boss, which I was very prone to, which is very common for people with imposter syndrome. And I had been suffering in it for a while. And my husband was like, "You need to leave this job." And I felt paralyzed. And he didn't understand it. He's like, "You're so skilled. You could go anywhere. Like, you got to just like put together your CV." And I just couldn't do it. And I was sitting in a staff meeting, a senior staff meeting. We were all women, and there was music playing. And somebody asked, "What's this music that's playing in the background?" And he said, "It's music to soothe the savage breast." And in that one moment, it was like I just got hit in the head. I was just like, oh my God, it all became clear to me how my experience of being fraudulent and not belonging was letting me sort of sit in these situations which were incredibly toxic, where people felt so empowered to just treat me however, that I just didn't want to put up with it anymore. And I kind of walked out of that room and I called my husband. I said, "I'm going to quit this job." And he said, "Quit it." And I cleared out my office over the weekend. And on Monday morning, I walked in and gave him my keys, and he threatened me. And he said, "I'd never work in education again." He said, he said all these things about how I was harming the program and blah, blah, blah. And I was petrified. It was my worst fear. But I think one of the things that it became clear to me was like, I just didn't want to do this anymore. I didn't want to live like this anymore. And so many people who come to me to kind of work on their imposter syndrome or talk to me about the book say, "I just don't want to live like this anymore. I don't want to kind of live through this lens." And people think of that as sort of like, it's normal. And when you're suffering with it, you know how painful it is. You know how difficult it is. You know how you're actively struggling in it. And it has such meaning to kind of want to change it. And it changed my life. That moment changed my life. It's what made me start my practice, what made me get licensed. It opened up my eyes for what I wanted for myself. And so.
Do you find that it's one of those things that like, once you figure it out, once you find the root cause, all those different things that you do the inner work in order to overcome it, do you feel like it's something you need to be somewhat hyper vigilant about? Or is it something that you can just be like, okay, I'm ready to go?
Yeah, I think it's something like, look, I still experience it here and there. I still will get triggered here and there, but I have tools. And I use my tools. And so when I get triggered, I don't go down the old rabbit holes. I don't work myself to death. I don't put up with toxic behavior. I'm very different than I was all those years ago because I have the tools. And so you just are conscious about the triggers. You're conscious about what it feels like, the cycles of imposter syndrome. And you know what they are. And so when you feel yourself slipping in them, you know what to do to kind of get out of them. And so it's a very different experience than feeling like you're trapped and you have no choice.
Definitely. I was going to say one of the interesting things I've learned, learning about therapy or anything like that, I find it fascinating where it's not like it really necessarily goes away. But yeah, you're right. If you wind up really learning the tools and really understanding how to truly identify those triggers in you and your behaviors, it's a lot easier to kind of switch that flip that switch rather.
It doesn't own you. And one of the things I've gotten to see as I've worked people through the book and different things, the empowerment and the agency of the same person. That was the same person that I worked with in the beginning. They have the same credentials, the same, but what they feel they are worth, what they will negotiate, what they will sort of like do for themselves, which they wouldn't do before. Like my husband has this saying, when you work as hard for yourself as you do for others, you're going to be unstoppable. And that's what working on imposter syndrome is about, is really turning that overwork that you do for others onto yourself and doing what you need for yourself first. And it really changes the game. I watch people do things that they never imagined they'd do once they're able to really address it. They're the same person, but they have a very different orientation about how to kind of utilize it and how to stand in it.
I think that was just about the best thing I have ever heard. Now, I never really thought of it. If you put as much work into, what you put in for everybody else into yourself, imagine what you can do. Goodness.
He echoed that to me when I was struggling. He said that to me like 100 times, but I couldn't hear it. I could hear it. I was like, it's brilliant and stupid at the same. I was like, I can't process this.
Because we're always thinking we have to do for everybody else, and we have to be able to show and quantify what we do in order to have value.
Yep. Yeah. And it is the cycle that you're on. And that's what you feel like has done for you in the past. Why wouldn't it do for you in the future? But you're breaking down and you're burning out and you're less productive and you're more sad about your life. Like, great things had happened in my life, but I didn't feel very happy. I felt very sad and very sort of disconnected from my what I wanted for myself. And it's such a different experience when I get to awaken that in somebody or help them awaken it. It's what I live for professionally, is to kind of get to see somebody really own who they are.
Well, Lisa, I am so thrilled for you coming on here today. And I feel like I learned so much, very interesting information. And I think I'm going to have to do some research, because I think that is amazing. Amazing. You have a wonderful day.
You too. Thank you for having me, Danielle.